The portion of God's Word that we'll focus our hearts on this morning comes from Genesis chapter 32. Let's begin with prayer. O Lord, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be always pleasing in your sight, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. We don't really need to sugarcoat it. This is kind of an odd section of Scripture. It's one of those Bible stories that leave both pastors and parishioners alike asking a lot of questions that God doesn't really give us answers to. And because this section about Jacob wrestling with God has that feel to it, it might be tempting for us to think that this is a section of Scripture that we can just sort of skim through quickly and shrug our shoulders and forget about. And yet I'd argue that this text about Jacob wrestling with God, this text is actually far more applicable and far more important for your life than you've ever realized before. And this morning I want to help to show you why that is. To start with, let's kind of look at it like a movie. All right, we got our first scene that comes onto the screen, and we see two men locked in this wrestling match in the darkness of the early morning hours. And the sounds of the rushing waters of the Jabbok River are flowing in the background, but they're really overshadowed and drowned out by the sounds of struggle and exertion. Now, earlier that day, our main character, whose name is Jacob, he took his whole family and all of his possessions, and he put them across that river and stayed on the other side by himself for a night of pouring out his heart to God. And so as the scene fades away with these two men locked in combat with each other, the screen rewinds and we go back to the very beginning to see how do we get to this point. The Bible tells us this isn't Jacob's first wrestling match. The Bible says that from the moment that these two brothers, Jacob and his twin brother Esau, were in their mother's womb, they were already fighting and struggling and wrestling with each other. It sounds like brothers, right? And as they wrestled and struggled, it was pointing ahead to future conflict that was coming. And when it was time for these twin boys to be born, Esau emerged first, and Jacob came right afterwards, grasping tightly to the heel of his brother. And therefore his parents named him Jacob, which means heel grabber. And that was an appropriate name for Jacob, not just because of the way that he was born, but because of the way that he lived his life. You see, heel grabber was a nickname that you would give to somebody who was kind of deceitful, and crafty, and tricky. And Jacob certainly lived up to that reputation. You see, before these boys were even born, God had already made a promise. He had promised that in a backwards way, a contrast to the normal primogeniture of their culture, when it came to Esau and Jacob, the older would serve the younger. But we see in the life of Jacob, as the scenes go by, we see this kind of recurring theme. That even though God made Jacob all sorts of promises, Jacob often doubted that God was going to come through and follow through on those promises. And so as his name would suggest, he often resorts to deception and cunning in order to get the things that he wants, the things that God had already promised to give him. So even though God already told him he was going to be the one who would receive the inheritance of his family, we see two occasions in the life of Jacob where he uses deception rather than simply trusting that God would give him what he had promised. First time we see Jacob deceiving his older brother Esau to give him his birthright for a bowl of soup. And then later we find Jacob deceiving their blind father in order to get the blessing that their father Isaac intended to give to his brother Esau. That second deception, that's what pushed Esau over the edge. He was so furious with his twin brother for taking his blessing from his father that he vowed then and there that when the time was right, he was going to kill his brother. And so Jacob fled. Fled alone by himself with almost nothing to his name. But as he flees, God comes and gives him an incredibly reassuring promise. He tells Jacob, "Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the west and to the east, to the north and to the south. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you and your offspring. I am with you and will watch over you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you." And then the scene shifts. We find Jacob, an older man. 20 years have gone by as he worked and lived with his uncle Laban. And during that time, we see Laban, who is equally as deceitful as his nephew Jacob. The two of them just sort of going back and forth with deceptions, trying to get the better of the other person. And despite all the deception that gets used to try and benefit himself, God is still faithful in keeping the promises that he made to Jacob. During the course of that 20 years, his family expands from just him by himself to a huge family, a man with 12 sons, exceedingly prosperous flocks and herds and servants. God was faithful in keeping his promise to bless Jacob while he was away. And yet the time came where God knew it was time for Jacob to go back home. And so he commands Jacob, "Go back to the land of your fathers and to your relatives." But again, he gives him a promise. "And I will be with you." But although God promised that he would go back with Jacob, Jacob still knew in the back of his mind who else was going to be waiting for him when he got back home. His brother that had vowed that he was going to kill him the next time that he saw him. And so as Jacob obeys God's commands, he makes his way closer and closer to his homeland, to his relatives, and he gets a message from some messengers who tell him, "Esau, your brother, is coming to meet you, and 400 men are with him." Why would Esau be bringing that many men to greet his brother, unless he was planning to attack and kill him and his family? And so filled with distress by this message that he receives, Jacob takes a couple of steps to try and mitigate his losses. First of all, he sends amazing, incredibly generous gifts. He sends it in 4 different waves to meet his brother along the way, trying to pacify his anger. And then he takes all of his family and all of his possessions and he splits them up into 2 groups, hoping that maybe if Esau attacked the one group, the other one would at least have time to get away. But deep down in his heart, he knew that deception wasn't going to work this time. That what he had been relying on in the past wasn't going to foot the bill. Now what he needed to rely on was the one who had been with him and keeping and making promises to him from before he was born. And so Jacob turns to God. He prays to God, and basically what he prays to God is just praying back to God all the promises that God had already made to him. Probably as much to remind himself of God's promises as anything else. And so he wrestles with God, pointing back to the promises God had made to him, holding God to his promises and holding on to God's promises. And as the night draws near, Jacob sends his family and his flocks and everything he owns across the river so that he can spend time alone on the other side of the Jabbok to do more of the same. And that brings us back to where we started. 2 men locked in a midnight wrestling match on the edges of the river. How do we get here? How do we get to this point where Jacob is wrestling in the middle of the night with an unknown person? You see, it kind of leads us to ask a lot of questions, doesn't it? How does this all get started, right? Does this stranger just sort of stroll into Jacob's camp and go, "Hey, you want to wrestle?" Does he jump him in the middle of the night when he's praying and not paying attention? How does this happen? We don't know. God doesn't tell us. And ultimately, it really doesn't matter. But what does matter about this wrestling match is who it is that Jacob is wrestling with. See, throughout the night, he had been wrestling with God verbally in prayer. But now he finds himself literally, physically wrestling with God. Which, again, leads to a whole bunch of questions. How is it possible for the all-powerful Spirit God, who is so vast that he fills the universe, how is it possible for him to wrestle with a finite human being without crushing him like a grape? And how is it possible for a sinful man like Jacob to wrestle with the holy God of the universe without melting like the Nazis and Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark? How does this work? We don't know. God doesn't tell us that answer. All we can tell is in some capacity, God takes on the appearance of a man. He sets aside the full use of his power and glory for a time, so that through this wrestling match, he can teach Jacob a very valuable and very visible lesson. So Jacob wrestles with God. And at first, it seems like he's doing pretty well, right? At first, it almost looks like he's winning, as God in human form acknowledges that he could not overpower Jacob. And you can almost kind of picture the confidence that Jacob had growing as this wrestling match goes on. Maybe he's telling himself, yeah, I'm strong enough to get through this problem. I can get through this struggle just as I've used my cunning and my deception in the past to get through all my previous jams. Until, with a simple touch, God shows Jacob just how hopeless and helpless he really was. We're told that God touched the socket of Jacob's hip so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. I was never a wrestler, but I imagine that it's nearly impossible to wrestle against a powerful opponent in a sport that requires a lot of lower body strength and leverage. It's got to be nearly impossible to wrestle somebody like that when your hip is out of socket. And so understanding the fact that he wasn't going to be able to win this battle anymore with his strength, Jacob does the only thing he could do. He clings on to the one he's wrestling with and refuses to let go, telling that man, I will not let you go unless you bless me. And that's exactly what God does. Right there in the camp, God blesses Jacob just as he promised he would. But first, he changes his name. He changes his name from Jacob, the heel grabber, into Israel, the God wrestler, the one who has struggled against God and man and overcome. And God changes his name because he himself had changed. No longer was he the guy who was reliant on his cunning and his deception to get the things that he wanted. Now understanding just how helpless he was a man who by faith simply clung to the power and promises of God and refused to let go. With a lifelong limp to be a constant reminder of that truth. And that's why this account of Jacob wrestling with God is so incredibly important and so incredibly impactful and applicable for each and every one of us here today. Because all of you know what it's like to wrestle with God. Say, maybe not, Pastor. I feel like I'd remember wrestling with God, and that doesn't ring any bells. Maybe you haven't physically wrestled with God in the way that Jacob did. But you all know what it's like to wrestle with God in prayer. You see, what's kind of shocking about this account, what makes it a little confusing is God appears to be the opponent in this account. He appears to be the adversary. He's like the big boss that Jacob needs to defeat and so he can receive the blessing he's looking for. God comes off as an opponent, an adversary, who's trying to crush and destroy Jacob, or at the very least trying to prevent him from receiving a blessing that he very much needed. And so in many ways, it comes off that Jacob is wrestling God so that Jacob can wrestle God's submission into Jacob's will. And when we think about God that way, it's easy to feel like prayer is kind of a pointless exercise. If we pray to God and we wrestle with God in prayer again and again and again and again, but nothing seems to change and it doesn't seem like God is listening, then it's easy for us to wonder whether prayer is worth it. See, when you pray for healing and yet it gets worse, when you pray to find love and yet you're still very begrudgingly single, when you pray that your kids would return to their faith in God, but they seem farther away from God than ever before, when you pray and you wrestle with God and it seems like it's not changing anything, it's easy to think of God as your opponent, your enemy, your adversary. And when you think about wrestling with God in prayer like that, like he's trying to prevent you from receiving something that you need, it's easy for us to quit. You see, if God tells us that we need to wrestle with him in prayer, and wrestle causes struggle and exertion and weariness, then in a culture that is very much struggle adverse, always wanting what is easiest and quickest and most efficient, the thought of needing to struggle with God in prayer sounds like something we should tap out of. Tapping out and saying to ourselves, maybe prayer doesn't work, or maybe God doesn't care. Maybe we're better off just depending on ourselves to get the things that we want. But this account shows us that when God is our opponent, when he opposes us as we wrestle with him in prayer, this account shows us that God does so not to crush us. Otherwise, he would have destroyed Jacob in a half a second. This shows that he opposes Jacob not because he's his enemy or his adversary. Otherwise, he wouldn't be looking for the opportunity to bless Jacob. And so that means that the same is true for us. Rather than this account being about Jacob wrestling God into submission to his will, this is an account about God wrestling Jacob into submission to the will of God. And that's why God wants us to persistently wrestle with God in our lives of prayer. Because it's through that he's going to work to wrestle our submission, or our will into submission to his will. And how does he do that? The same way that he did for Jacob. See, in a time of fear, in a time of uncertainty, in a time of trouble, Jacob fully acknowledged that there was nothing that he could do to save himself. And so he turns to God, leaning heavily on God in prayer. And as he did that, it was a reminder for him of all the things that God had promised to him. Promises to be with him, to protect him, to preserve him, to prosper him. Promises to bring him back to his homeland. Promises to keep expanding his family line. Promises that he would be the son that received the inheritance of Isaac. And as Jacob was reminded of God's promises as he wrestled in prayer with God, it helped to bring his will into submission to God's will. He leaned on God. And the same is true for us. That as we wrestle with God and it feels like God is the opponent and we struggle to have the things that we feel like we need, it forces us to remember the promises that God has made to us. See, as we struggle, as we ask God for things, and if he doesn't fulfill them, if it seems like he's the opponent, that forces us to check our prayers with the promises that God has made to us. Promises to make all things work out for our good. Promises to be with us always. Promises to bless us, not to harm us. Promises to never leave us or forsake us. Promises to give us life eternal through Jesus. And when we wrestle and reflect on the promises that God has made to us, God wrestles our will into submission to his. So that just like the former heel grabber turned God wrestler said, I will not let you go unless you bless me. You see, especially when you realize you have nothing that you can cling to except for God and his power and his promises, especially then, God promises that he is going to bless you. He will bless you because his will be done. And that's the best thing that we could possibly ask God to do. Your will be done. And that's why we can pray that prayer every day. Not my will, but yours be done. And we can pray that prayer confidently because we've heard it before. We heard that prayer another time that God set aside the full use of his power and glory. We heard that prayer another time that God took on not just the appearance of a man, but took on a true human nature so that he could be born into this world and wrestle with sin and death and hell. We've heard this prayer before when the Son of God wrestles in prayer with the will of his Father. As Jesus prays in the garden, Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me. Yet not my will, but yours be done. And so as we wrestle with God in prayer, just as Jesus wrestled with his Father in prayer, we can do so clinging tightly to the promises that God has made to us, most fully revealed at a bloody cross and an empty tomb. We can pray like the heel grabber turned God wrestler. I will not let you go, Lord. I will not let you go unless you bless me. And once again, to Jacob, God kept his promises. God kept his promises just as he said he would. Because when Esau finally meets up with Jacob, he doesn't attack and kill him and his family. He welcomes him in a warm embrace. And just as God promised, God brought Jacob safely back to his homeland. Just as God promised, he increased and prospered his family and his wealth. Just as God promised to Adam and Eve, from Jacob's family line would come the one who would be born into this world to wrestle sin and death and hell and overcome it in victory. And so the fact is, as the camera fades out and zooms out, as we see Jacob limping his way into the sunrise, the camera now turns and it points on you. And it looks at you and the way that you and I wrestle with God in prayer and struggle with God in prayer in our own lives. I got a couple of reminders of that wrestling and struggle this week personally. A friend, a fellow Wells pastor, just 40 years old with a wife and kids and an important ministry that he was carrying out, killed in a car accident. And it makes us ask the questions that seem to go unanswered. Why? Why so young? Why him when he had so much important gospel ministry still to do? But the questions go unanswered. And on Friday, I was at the Mayo Clinic visiting with a Wells lady who was getting treatment for colon cancer from South Carolina. And part of her treatment and her surgery went bad. And so now she's on that brink of not knowing whether she's going to make it or not. And she and her husband are wrestling with God. She wrestling with God in prayer that he would simply call her home and set her free from her pain and her suffering of this world. And him wrestling with God because he doesn't want to leave his wife. And so they're wrestling with God, and the questions of, why am I still here? Or the questions of, why would you take her, Lord? They seem to go unanswered. And yet when we wrestle with God, clinging to his promises and clinging to his power, we do have the answers. Because God promises us through that cross and empty tomb that when we die in faith in Jesus, we live. And he tells us that whether we live or die, we are with Jesus and Jesus is with us. So whatever it is that you're wrestling with God about, when you cling to the promises and the power of God, then you can say with a confident heart, I will not let you go unless you bless me. Not my will, but yours be done, Lord. Keep wrestling, friends. Keep wrestling every single day, because the God who has promised to bless you will. Just as he never failed to keep his promises to Jacob, so he will never fail to keep his promises to you. So keep wrestling, clinging to him and refusing to let go, and he will bless you.